Hey guys, and welcome back to chapter 10 of the Saints of Snowville. Let's get started. Soren Petersen was converted to the church in Denmark in 1891, and the same year emigrated, at age 23, to the United States. He was converted to the gospel by Peter Stevenson and came to Salt Lake City in the company of converts who accompanied Stevenson on his return from a mission. Brother Petersen worked on the railroad in Ogden, Utah, for 2 years and saved $500. He had been raised on a dairy farm in Denmark and worked as a section hand on the railroad only until he could save enough money to make a down payment on a farm. In the fall of 1893, he came to Snowville and made a down payment on a dairy farm 2 miles north of town. His friend Stevenson had been looking for a farm and advised him when the opportunity to purchase developed. Brother Petersen married a Snowville girl and worked on the farm for the next 45 years to support his large family and build up Zion. Soren Petersen was a tough old Dane and greatly admired. In the winter of 1918, he lost his left leg in a logging accident. He was skidding logs in Snowville Canyon alone, and the weather was 20 below zero, with the prospect of 40 below by dark. When he was attempting to load a section of a log from the skids to the sleigh, a log slipped and pinned his left foot and part of his leg under it. The log was large, and Soren sustained a compound fracture between the ankle and knee. He couldn't move the log and was helplessly pinned. After struggling for about an hour in excruciating pain, he fully recognized his predicament. He was going to freeze to death unless something was done. The weather would soon be 40 below, and already his entire leg was numb, and he was getting sleepy. A sure sign of freezing, it was 5 p.m., and it would be at least 5 hours before anyone started to worry about him, as he frequently came home from the canyon after 10 at night. It would be another 2 hours before he was found. Brother Petersen knew what he had to do. He took his sharp pocket knife and cut off his leg about 3 inches below the knee. The leg was already numb, so he didn't feel too much pain. A tourniquet was fashioned from a bootlace above the knee before the cutting. He could tell about where to cut because of the bone was through the skin. The amputation was jagged because of the break was irregular. Soren passed out briefly twice, but completed his task in about 20 minutes. Getting on a horse and traveling to Snowville was a nightmare, but he made it. He collapsed on the porch of the first farmhouse. The first 2 weeks it was touch and go to save Petersen's life. After that, for the next month, Dr. Peck was prepared each day to amputate the remainder of the leg, but wouldn't wait one more day. About a year later, Brother Petersen was fitted with a wooden leg. A few days after the accident, the amputated portion of the leg was brought out of the canyon and buried in the Snowville Cemetery. In 1938, 71-year-old Pegleg Petersen, a high priest in the Snowville ward, was deeply in debt and in trouble. In November, the Petersen barn, together with 100 tons of alfalfa hay, had burned. Elder Petersen had a mortgage on his farm and a chattel mortgage on his cows, and could not borrow any more money. He owed $500 on open accounts, but all of his obligations were current. Bishop Jackson assumed that church welfare would come to the aid of Petersen. A request was made to the stake president, and it was forthwith turned down. In answer to the bishop's inquiry as to the reason for this disallowance, President Benson said, Brother Petersen had some heifers he could sell, and also a chattel mortgage on his cows is small. He could realize something on the sale of his cows. The bishop reasoned that the livestock was needed in order for Soren Petersen to make a living, and if they were sold, there would be no need to rebuild the barn or buy hay, and that, in fact, this would result in Soren and his wife being a permanent welfare case. Benson said, My instructions are that the person is not eligible for welfare if he has assets that can be converted to cash. In spite of the bishop's spirited argument, Benson was adamant and said that he would have to take the matter up with the Salt Lake if he deviated from instructions. The bishop told the stake president to go to hell and left Paris in a rage. Bishop Jackson's immediate problem was how to explain welfare denial to Soren Petersen, and for the matter to this word, since the promulgation of the church welfare plan more than 2 years before, the church had received a lot of favorable publicity, and the saints in Snowville and elsewhere had supported the plan enthusiastically. Now, the first time a request was made, it was denied similarly. There was no question about Brother Peterson's worthiness for church help. He had been a ward teacher continuously for 45 years. He had been superintendent of the Sunday school for 10 years. He had been on the finance committee for every fund drive in the ward. He had been chairman in the genealogy committee for 20 years. He had worked on the ward's private welfare project 5 years before he got around to welfare matters in Salt Lake City. He had scrupulously paid an honest tithe and made more than his share of the church contributions. In short, Brother Peterson had done everything asked by those in authority and more. It was cruelly ironic that the church had impoverished the Petersons and now was rejecting them in their hour of need. Soren Peterson had been attracted to the church 47 years before in Denmark because of its financial structure. The fact that the church didn't pay its preachers greatly impressed the young Dane. While this didn't have anything to do with his conversion, it did interest him initially. And he reasoned that with such a financial setup, the church should have ample money for basic purposes. Brother Peterson soon learned, however, that the Mormon church was by far the most expensive church in the world to belong to. In the past 10 years, the Peterson farm had produced about $15,000 net income. Soren had paid exactly $1,500 in tithing. He paid $150 in fast offerings. During the decade, the Petersons paid $250 for ward maintenance. Another $300 was paid for auxiliary organizations and seminary dues. Church magazines and books cost another $150. The church pushed the sale of its popular magazine, The Era, in order to help make up some deficit incurred by its liability, the Deseret News. The ward's private welfare plan and the church plan cost Soren $50 cash, 2 heifers, 10 tons of hay, and a lot of work. A combination steakhouse and seminary buildings in Paris cost him $300. The addition of 3 classrooms and other improvements to the ward chapel in Snowville cost another $200 of Peterson's share. The Bear Lake Stake belonged to the Logan Temple District. When an annex in 1934 was added and the temple renovated, Brother Peterson's proportionate share was $50. A Latter-day Saints hospital in Paris cost the old Dane $100. In the past 10 years, 2 Peterson boys had fulfilled a mission, one in Denmark and the other in California. This cost Soren $1,900. These expenditures were a matter of church record. The extent of the expenditures, such as the special donations and the cost to travel to Paris, Montpelier, and other wards on church business, was not known to the bishop. Neither was the cost of excursions to the Logan and Salt Lake temples, and donations direct to the temple to hire people to work for the dead known. The cash donations to the church alone amounted to more than 1/3 of Peterson's income. The bishop had known for some time that the church required in excess of 1/3 of an active member's income for church purposes. He was also expected to contribute about the same proportion of his time. A bishop, of course, was expected to contribute in excess of 1/2 his time working in the vineyard of the Lord. The father of the ward never complained, however, of the demands of his time and means. He had been abundantly blessed during his tenure as bishop, but he sometimes wondered how others stood it. The bishop could not understand why President Benson was so anxious to send so much of the proceeds of the welfare project and the fast offerings to Salt Lake. Since the welfare plan had been announced church-wide, less than 10% of the funds had been used in the Bear Lake Stake, and the balance had been sent to the Salt Lake City. Only a portion of the fast offerings was likewise used locally. Once the fast offerings and welfare money got sent to Salt Lake, it was hard to get any of it back. Brother Jackson recalled that when he was first made a bishop, he had a free hand with the fast offerings collected in the Snowville ward. The Doctrine and Covenants specifically charged the bishop and the bishop alone with duty to use the fast offerings in the ward as he saw fit. Now the bureaucrats in the office of the presiding bishop in the Salt Lake City were dictating the use of fast offerings. The bishop received a flood of communiques from the presiding bishop's office criticizing his use of the fast offerings, setting out what was and was not proper, and always pleading that more of the fund to be sent to Salt Lake. "These damn saints in the Salt Lake City are getting fat off our funds," the bishop told his counselors about once a year when the annual account was made and he saw the extent of the remittance to Salt Lake. It was well known that the family receiving church welfare in Salt Lake City lived better than the average non-welfare family in Bear Lake Valley. The church was fabulously wealthy, thought the bishop, and it was easy to see how it had got that way. But that didn't help a poor member of many families from church headquarters. The bishop sometimes supposed that the church operated principally for the benefit of the saints in Salt Lake City, but mostly for the Smiths, Youngs, Taylors, Snows, and other Brahmin families who inherited high church positions. That night, after returning from Paris, the bishop called his two counselors to a meeting at the meeting house. He explained to them the fruitless visit to the stake headquarters. "Now that the church is large and wealthy," said Fred Calvert, "it has become cold and impersonal without much regard for individuals. It's becoming as bureaucratic as the federal government," volunteered Counselor Hunter. The Snowville ward couldn't let down a faithful old member like Soren Peterson. The bishopric agreed. "Under no circumstances can he be allowed to go on county relief," said the bishop. They all agreed that the ward would go it alone. In marshaling the ward assets, it was found that there was $205 in the fast offering fund. The bishop hadn't remitted this fund for 3 months in spite of directives to do so. The private welfare fund had $125 and 12 head of livestock. 2 of the cows could be sold for $60 each. The bishopric decided to ask the Mutual Improvement Association to sponsor a benefit dance. This should raise another $100. It was decided to ask the elders' quorum to sponsor a logging project. The logs could then be traded to the sawmill for most of the rough lumber required to rebuild the barn. On November 19th and 20th, 1938, the community of Snowville built a barn on the Peterson farm. The elders had previously cut the logs but couldn't haul them to the mill until the snow came. Brother Evans, owner of the sawmill, however, let the ward have lumber on the credit of those logs in the woods to be delivered in January. On November 1950, men and boys began the construction of a barn. The Ward Relief Society served a sumptuous noon meal on the 19th and 20th. On November 20th, the barn was serviceable, though not complete. Brother Peterson could complete the barn as time permitted in the winter. Everyone felt good about the project and had fun. The bishop still had $220 cash. With this, he bought 22 tons of hay. 50 farmers in the community each gave Brother Peterson a load of hay. This gave him 72 tons of hay for the winter. If necessary, the bishop could buy him a few more tons later in the winter, when more fast offerings came in. The Peterson Project was another one of the many projects and incidents that knitted the Snowville ward into a close unit. No one complained about the project or their contribution. Several said to the bishop, "What about the church welfare plan? Have we been paying into it?" The bishop lied a little and said, "The church has had unusual expenses this year. Many men are out of work in Salt Lake and Ogden. The funds would be a little time to come to Salt Lake, and Brother Peterson needs his barn now."